For each of the games I've done retrospective videos on so far, it's been one that I've both played and enjoyed, one where I sat on the side of the fence that holds it in high esteem, and one that I will defend in a discussion regarding its quality. But I can't do videos on games I liked as a kid forever, unfortunately, and what better way to start 2019 than with one that I had only ever played on a friend's laptop for 30 minutes back in 2005. And as you can probably tell by the title, that game is 2003's Command & Conquer Generals. There have been no shortage of people telling me I should play this game, and not just since I've been making videos for this channel. So it's about time that I gave it a shot, and there's not going to be any nostalgia goggles on for this one. So let's get started.
In the modern world, great leaders resolve their conflicts with words. Shed launcher. Carbon bombing. Tomahawk missiles.
Hey Luke.
Yeah.
I'm writing an essay on 2003 era diplomats, and I need to do a section on words they used in conversation. Do you know any good ones?
Maybe a Scud launcher?
What's a Scud launcher?
Oh, Tomahawk missile?
What? Who says that?
Looking back at Generals, it's an interesting title to say the least. In a few ways, it feels like it's the first in a new era of Command & Conquer games, leaving classics like Tiberian Sun and Red Alert behind it. Generals was developed by EA Pacific, which was formerly Westworld Pacific, who had helped to create both Red Alert 2 and its expansion Yuri's Revenge. In fact, this was the last Command & Conquer to be made before EA Pacific and series creator Westworld were dissolved and absorbed into EA Los Angeles, who inherited the license and would go on to develop later entries like the pretty great Tiberium Wars and the somewhat disappointing Tiberium Twilight. In fact, Generals feels a lot like Tiberium Wars, partly due to the fact that it's built on the same engine, as well as having mechanics that were brought along to that entry. Personally, I've actually played a lot of CNC3 in my time, so I'll primarily be using that as my main comparison. Generals was also the series' first foray into the 3D RTS realm, something that was starting to become more and more popular with the advancement of computer graphics technology. While being inherently divisive due to its huge differences when compared to classic 2D RTSs, people were open to the concept, though I can't say it's helped in its case today. But we'll talk about that soon. So that leads us to the question: should you play Command & Conquer Generals in 2019? After booting up and playing Generals for the first time, it felt immediately familiar to me, someone who's played a fair few RTSs in his day. I started with the campaign, and the reason I use quotation marks in there is because there's no real narrative here. It honestly just feels like a bunch of scenarios tied together without any story or reason for existing other than destroy the bad guys because they're bad. There are separate campaigns for each of the game's three factions, which is nice to see, but it's disappointing here because of what we've come to expect with the series' history. Command & Conquer games had traditionally been quite narrative heavy in the campaigns, with their trademark style of cheese-filled FMV cutscenes giving them a really memorable quality. Unfortunately, those are missing, instead having most of the plot points delivered through what are frankly uninspired loading screens and in-engine cutscenes. Now, while there are other games I've looked at recently that have no campaign to speak of, such as Rise of Nations and Sins of a Solar Empire, the reason I'm making a big deal of it here but not in those videos is that when you play Command & Conquer, you expect there to be an at least somewhat entertaining story. You expect to see nods charismatically to Kane going up against the GDI, or some C-list actors hamming it up on a mediocre green screen. But there's none of that. At least the game's expansion 0 Hour saw the return of those beloved cutscenes, as well as a story that offers a lot more than the one it builds upon, but it's still unfortunate we didn't get to see it in the base game. Moving on to its gameplay, Generals is a traditional base building RTS through and through. There's two resources together which keeps things simple. Supplies are harvested from deposits around the map, and power is generated by stations that you build yourself. Having only 2 resources allows you to focus on the important task of building your base and your armies, which makes for an action-packed experience most of the time. It also means that matches can be quick, although you can drag them out with some decently large maps and multiple players. The game features 3 factions: the USA, China, and the woefully generic Global Liberation Army. That means they're terrorists. Each faction has their own art style and unit types, so there's decent variation to be had when choosing who to play as, even more if you're playing 0 Hour, which gives the game new units and mechanics to be used. They all play differently as well, with each faction having overarching benefits and drawbacks. The United States have the most advanced technology and the best aircraft, but theirs is also the most expensive. The GLA on the other hand are nearly the exact opposite. The units aren't as powerful, but they're really cheap, and you can use their crude but very effective tactics and units to your advantage. Lastly, China is somewhat a mix of the other 2 factions, occupying a middle ground in both price and combat effectiveness. They have a lot of units that work well in large groups, promoting large armies and a kind of horde style of gameplay. Like the campaign, you can play as any of the 3 factions in the game's skirmish modes, both solo or with other players. Along with the expected unit variety between factions, there's also an in-game leveling system that unlocks abilities and units to be used throughout that single match alone to help differentiate each game. It's presented as the amount of stars you have as the titular general, starting at 1 and going up to 5. You get points as you play by destroying enemy units and the like, and once you have enough the game will award you with a shiny new star. Each new point allows you to unlock something new, like a rechargeable A-10 missile strike or specific special unit. It reminded me of a very similar system used in Company of Heroes, and it works just as well here as it did in that game. You earn stars at a decent rate, and the things you unlock can have meaningful impacts on the game when you utilise them correctly. There are some other little gameplay features that I really appreciated as well, like being able to upgrade certain units with special additions, like a companion drone that repairs and assists in combat, or one that increases view distance significantly. After playing a lot of CNC3 and loving the unit upgrades in that game, I was pretty stoked to see them in its predecessor. Along with having individual units rank up and become more effective through combat experiences with that satisfying. While at this point in time General's gameplay is nothing new, I still found it to be really enjoyable. Its fast pace and high action keep it from being stale, and there's enough variety in the game's factions and mechanics that you won't get bored quickly. All this leads to a classic RTS experience that will leave you feeling a sense of nostalgia for the glory days of real-time strategy. The main downside with the General gameplay is that playing multiplayer can be a bit more of an uphill battle than you might expect. Your mileage may vary, but for me owning the Origin version of Generals, we had a difficult time getting Game Ranger working for co-op play, which led to the game crashing all the time. So instead we had to use a third-party program called GenTools, which did work out in the end, though it does require a bit of initial setup. Again, you may have an easier time if, say, you own the original disc version. However, I did think it's worth mentioning, as buying it on Origin is probably the most common way of getting the game today. No matter how much of a fan you are of Generals, you can't deny that the game looks old. That's not inherently a bad thing, though I do think it applies more here though because of the game's 3D graphics and somewhat lack of stylized art. In the early 2000s, 3D graphics were starting to become more popular, and for RTS games it was no exception. While there were still some releases sticking to the tried and true 2D formula, such as the recently released Stronghold Crusader, most big game franchises were making the switch. Warcraft 3 did it in mid-2002, and so had Age of Mythology at the end of that same year. Times were changing, and Command & Conquer was about to change with it. The problem is that, in my opinion, those early 3D titles didn't age nearly as well as their 2D counterparts which were released at the same time. Though some have survived the years better than others, I don't think Generals is part of that group. For something like Warcraft 3, its stylized art helps to keep it visually interesting when compared to the mostly muted colour palette and the overall pretty generic units and buildings in Generals. That combined with very blocky models and barren textures make for a graphical experience that's pretty underwhelming, and it stands out like a sore thumb playing it in 2019. Though I should mention that, in my opinion, they're not as bad as what's found in the land battles of 2006's Star Wars Empire at War. Yeesh, that was pretty rough. Something else worth noting here is that I did have to either edit the INI file or use GenTools to boost the resolution of Generals to 1080p. Ugh. And saying all that, some of the game's effects actually still look pretty nice. Generals does run on the Sage engine after all, which is the same one that powers Command & Conquer 3, and that game has some of my favourite effects in any RTS. Missile trails and gunfire look and sound awesome, and the explosions all have a solid punch that makes combat encounters feel a lot more visceral and entertaining to watch, just like they do in CNC3. It's just a shame that all these encounters are bogged down by some of the most generic looking units I've seen in a long time. Maybe it's just because I'm used to Command & Conquer games being pretty out there and wacky when it comes to their unit design, but apart from a couple of notable exceptions such as the Chinese Overlord tank, GLA Toxin tractors, or the USA Spectre gunship from 0 Hour, General's infantry units and vehicles are pretty visually uninteresting. Damn you modern era inspired combat units. As for General's soundtrack, I actually found it to be pretty great. There are specific themes and tunes for each faction, and they complement the game's fast-paced and combat-focused gameplay. Some of the battle tracks in particular are actually quite memorable, and while they can be somewhat cheesy, especially the ones for the USA, they're pretty badass. Lastly, on the audio front, we have the voice acting. And in typical Command & Conquer fashion, it's cheesy, over the top, and thoroughly entertaining to listen to. I especially like the voices for the United States, where you have stereotypical, gruff men talking about delivering justice, fighting for peace, and destroying the enemies of freedom. While I have heard a few opinions online about how some of the lines are offensive or in poor taste nowadays, especially in the case of the GLA, I don't think those claims hold much water, as the game is so tongue-in-cheek that it's hard to take things like that verbatim. In my opinion, it all melts together great and really helps the game in not being too serious. Which is good, because if you've played the campaign, you know that the first mission for the US sees the GLA bombing civilians with anthrax. Yeesh. That could get dark really fast. But General's music and dialogue do a great job in keeping the game from being too stern and dreary. Something to consider when looking at Command & Conquer Generals in 2019 is that, unlike a lot of the RTSs I've looked at on this channel previously, it hasn't been lucky enough to receive any sort of remake or remaster, so old issues like the aforementioned resolution problems are something you may run into, though I should say that once I fixed that, I didn't run into any more snags on a modern Windows 10 equipped PC. And if you don't own a disc copy, then you'll need to buy it on Origin, which may be a deal breaker for some people, and honestly that's fair enough. EA's launcher is laggy, generally unresponsive, and quite the resource hog, despite the fact that it's been available for years now. Not only that, to my knowledge you can't buy the game individually, you need to buy the Command & Conquer Ultimate Collection, which in fairness is actually pretty great value for $10 US for the number of games you get with it. It's worth mentioning that if you're subscribed to Origin Access, you do have access to the whole package through there. So, Command & Conquer Generals. Should you play it in 2019? Well, that depends. If you used to play it back in the day, then I'm sure you'll have no problem diving back in, as the nostalgia alone will help you alleviate its 16-year-old trappings, like the graphics and a bit of modern PC compatibility issues that I ran into. It's still a blast to play, and the gameplay is exciting enough to keep you entertained. However, it's not an easy of a recommendation if you have never played it before and don't have those memories from when you were young. Speaking from my own perspective, I still had fun with my time in the game, though its issues did stand out to me more than a game that I'd had previous experience with. If you're looking for a classic, action-packed RTS from back in the day, then Generals will deliver. But in my opinion, it doesn't do anything in particular better than any other strategy game that is available today. Would I personally choose to play it over another RTS such as Command & Conquer 3 or World in Conflict? For me, probably not. But if a friend wanted to play it with me and they asked me to join, would I? Definitely. I'd have a damn good time doing it. Thanks for watching, everyone. Now just at the end, just a bit of a PS, you may have noticed that the video title is slightly different to previous videos in the series, and that's because we're having a bit of a change up for 2019. So these should you play videos are going to be pretty similar to how they were before, possibly with a bit more of a focus on the should you play aspect and less of, you know, any history behind the development, things like that. So instead there will be something replacing that. I'm not going to talk about that quite yet, as there's still a bit of planning to do. But it'll probably be 2 or 3 months-ish, and then we should have maybe the first episode of that, and I'll be giving more information about that in the next channel update, which will probably be at the end of this month or start of February, depending on how we go. I've also got a couple of other video series planned, which I'll be talking about in that update as well, so stay tuned for that. Also just wanted to say a huge thanks. We just passed 1,000 subscribers about a week ago, which is so crazy, so cool to see. I'm so stoked. Thanks for everyone for commenting, liking, subscribing, just watching. It means a lot, and again, thank you all. So thanks for watching. Leave any comments down below of future games you'd like to see. I've got a bit of a list going and I'll do my best to get to some of those. And we're also back to our 2-week schedule, so we will be going back to bi-weekly videos, and I'm hoping to maybe boost that up a bit, but we will see. So again, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.